This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. We're continuing to talk about Wilds of Eldraine. Last week I did my video that I do in every set around this time, which is 10 cards you should stop playing, based on the data we have from 17 lands. And as usual, following that video, I do one on 10 cards you should be playing more of. Basically, both of these videos take the data from 17 lands, which is, go to 17lands.com. You can sign up to have them track your limited data. And if you do that, you add to the data pool, which is already quite large, of people whose data is being tracked. And this is where we get this information that I'm going to be talking about in this video, about win rates and where the card is picked and things like that. So last week we looked at cards that had lower win rates than they should for when people were taking them. This time we're going to be looking at cards with higher win rates than you'd expect based on when people are taking them. As usual, in this kind of video, I like to start off with a baseline type card. And this time around, we're going to go with Root Rider Fawn. So we can all agree that this thing is a pretty good common, right? Well, it has a 55.8% win rate, and it's picked right around a 6th pick. So, that's a reasonable win rate. The thing to keep in mind that I always make sure to say in these videos, there's a few things to keep in mind about this data. Number one, the overall win rate on 17 lands is 55.3. So the average person there has a win percentage 5.3% higher than your typical limited player on Arena. So even though 55.8 actually sounds like insane, like that, if this took into account literally everyone who's drafting on Magic Arena, that would be amazing. But it doesn't. It only takes into account these people with an above average win rate. And Root Rider Fawn's win rate of 55.8% is pretty good. It's above the average. And while 0.5% may not seem like a ton above the average, it's significant enough that obviously Root Rider Fawn does come out as a pretty good common. After all, it has passable stats. It can filter your mana so you can play off-color adventures. It can ramp your mana. So it's a nice card. But as is usually the case when I pick these baseline cards, we're going to see that every card on this list is picked later than Root Rider Fawn and has a higher win rate. So, that sort of gives you an idea of where these cards fall within the broader format. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Let's start with the number one, the first of these cards I want to talk about, which is Spell Stutter. So it has a 57.2% win rate and it's picked around 8.4. So, yeah, that's a lot higher than Root Rider Fawn, right? Well, this card's an interesting one because blue overall in this set is probably the weakest color, and that's what the data says too. But there are some cards, and we're going to see at least two of them in this video. Do I have more than two blue cards? I think I just have two blue cards. We're going to see two blue cards that, despite blue having a lower win rate than everything else, actually have pretty high win rates. And they're cards that are basically essential if you're going to succeed in blue, as is indicated by these win rates. So Spell Stutter is one of these. The biggest problem blue has in this format that makes it harder to compete with the other colors is the other colors have like really good 1 and 2 drops. Blue really doesn't. So what you need is Spell Stutter as your 2-drop sort of, so you can counter an opposing 2 or 3-drop and keep the game under control before you can get to a later stage in the game. And so Spell Stutter is kind of an essential card if you're going to have a successful blue deck in this format, especially if you're sort of a controlling deck. It does maintain viability for a lot of the game. Overall this card has overperformed. It just ends up being capable of hard countering things often enough that it's been pretty nice. And in the early game, it's really good. Like, you want this in your opening hand in basically every blue deck. You really need for it to be there or you're going to be in trouble. So having multiples is even a pretty good idea. So Spell Stutter has been quite good overall. And, part of the reason it's picked as late as it is because people are wary of blue. And that certainly has an impact. And that's something else to keep in mind with this data. This is not like ironclad. There are, data might, seem like it's empirical, and it is to some extent, but there are flaws with it based on, what the data actually represents. We aren't always able to interpret that fully or understand it fully. Basically, what I'm saying is this does not mean you should always take Spell Stutter before you take a Root Rider Fawn. It depends on a lot of things that are going on in your draft. And even in a pack one, pick one, maybe you could make an argument that the Fawn is a better pick than Spell Stutter because green's a stronger color. So, there's a whole mess of stuff going on. But my only point is, first, this card's really important for your blue decks. Second, you could probably start taking it a little higher. If you have a really good blue first pick, like I don't hate the idea of starting to take Spell Stutters by the 4th or 5th pick because they're so crucial for your blue decks to succeed. So yeah, Spell Stutter, better than you think, and should probably be getting taken a little bit higher. Next up is the other blue card on this list that I wanted to talk about, and that is Into the Fey Court. I talked about this card before when looking at 10 cards I was wrong about in the format. Early on, it was pretty clear that this was better than I expected it to be, and it has maintained that status. It has the same win rate as Spell Stutter. Again, really high for a blue card because blue overall is not so good in the format, and it's picked a little bit later than Spell Stutter. And the fact it's taken a little bit later makes sense. You don't generally want more than one of these in most of your decks. It doesn't really add to the board, but this is a card that, again, is kind of crucial for blue decks. At least having one of is nice. Maybe Crucial's a little stronger. Spell Stutter is a 2-drop, so it's something you really need. But a lot of the time, if you can find a way to stabilize, make your opponent, lose momentum, and then you cast this, the game is usually just over. Like, if you've been playing this format, you've done that to people, or you've had people do it to you where you're just like out of gas, your blue opponent has stabilized, and then they cast Into the Fey Court. I mean, the more impressive thing is when they draw cards with hatching plans. That's like the really nuts thing you can do. But Into the Fey Court is a nice, sort of facsimile of that. If you can get your hand on hatching plans alternatively, and you have Bargain in your deck, that's obviously going to be better. But drawing 3 is just a great way to pull ahead of your opponent on a stable board. And it even adds to the board. I mean, the body's not that significant, but it's there. Next, let's look at 2 different cards. Those are Twisted Fealty and Ariette's Tempting Apple. I have them together for obvious reasons. They're both threat and effects, and they've both performed really well in this format. Fealty is the better of the two, 59.7% win rate. You can pick it up around 7.3. That's when people are picking it on average. Tempting Apple, lower win rate at 56.7, but people are taking it around an 8th pick. The Fealty is obviously the one that is, it's like way better than Tempting Apple is. And obviously it's the one that's really, really good. But the Apple is too. And the reason these are both good, it's for the same reason. So one really fascinating thing about this format is that these 2 cards are good despite the fact that there's not a very strong sacrifice theme in the set. I mean, I know there's Bargain. Obviously, Bargain's a thing. But Bargain isn't really a consistent way to sacrifice the things you steal because it only lets you do it with tokens or artifacts or enchantments. And when you can do that, these do feel extra insane. But if that's the only way these worked out, these win rates wouldn't be this high. The fact is you have that sort of upside that threat and effects always have. But even in the absence of a heavy sacrifice theme, these have both worked out better than they looked because the format has just been so aggressive. There are a lot of games where you can just curve out 1 through 3, play Twisted Fealty on turn 4 and just kill your opponent. You take their best creature and attack them with everything. The fact you get a Wicked Roll token means you get permanent value on your side of the battlefield, unlike most threat and effects, which usually only give you a temporary advantage. Same thing with the Apple. You have a card that permanently, well, not permanently, but you have a card that sits around and then can do something else after stealing something. Both of them also give you something you can sacrifice for Bargain, and I don't mean stealing your opponent's thing you can sacrifice for Bargain. I mean the Apple's an artifact and the roll token's an enchantment, and a token. So both of these have been really, really good, and red aggro decks are really the best things you got going in this format. Red, white, and red, black aggro are the best decks in the format. There is, the black-green sort of mid-range deck is sort of the one that can keep those 2 in check, but basically no other deck in the format can really compete with those 2. And this is, this is partly why, because you have these relatively efficient threat and effects that give you some additional upside. Both of these could, based on their win rate and everything, you could be taking them higher. So both of these have been better than expected. On a similar note, so has Nwing Crescendo. You want one of these in basically every red deck because both red, white, and red, black go wide. It's obviously at its best in black, red because of the rat thing, and black, red is a little better at going wide than red, white is, but they're both pretty darn good at it. And Crescendo is picked as late as 10.4 on average, and it has a 56.7% win rate. Same as the Apple, not as high as the other cards we've looked at so far, right? This kind of card has problems, namely that if you're not really... There are more situations than you'd like where this doesn't really do anything, basically. And that is kind of a problem. This format is aggressive enough in its red decks that this sort of Trumpet Blast effect, which is normally like a D level card, is like a C. And you want really, maybe even sort of a build around C+. You kind of want one of these in every red, white, and red, black deck you draft. Even in red, green, it can work out okay. So, the fact it's taken as late as it is partly a reflection of the fact that you usually don't want more than one, but it should probably still be getting taken before the last third of a pack, because it is important enough for red, black, and red, white decks to really be powerful. There's also Brave the Wilds. So this one actually has a slightly lower win rate than Root Rider Fawn at 55.7%. But it's picked a lot later at 8.66, and I think they're actually kind of comparable cards. Brave the Wilds doesn't ramp you, that's for sure, but it does fix your mana really efficiently and cheaply, like one of the other decks in the format that can be a real force, and it even can compete with the aggro decks if you have the right stuff going on, like Spell Stutters are like blue-green based, like 4 and 5 color decks, where you're running things like Brave the Wilds and Root Rider Fawn. Not to mention Hatching Plans. Once again, that card comes up. Brave the Wilds is great when you cast it on turn 1 in those decks. And then later in the game, the great thing about this card is when we've seen this sort of thing in the past, they're pretty bad top decks late. But in this format, you usually get a 3-3 out of this in the later stage of the game because you usually have something expendable. And that 3-3 has haste. I mean, that's a real body that you get out of this card. So running like 5 of these, which I've done before, not really a bad idea in sort of a base green deck that is playing a bunch of other colors. It just always does something. I mean, it isn't insane as the win rate would indicate to you, but it is a perfectly solid card, and especially if you're playing it in the right kind of deck. I do think people are playing it a little too much. I know some people are saying, like, you should just play this in every one of your green decks. I'm not quite there, personally. I think you need to at least be splashing a third color for you to really want this. And I think the win rate sort of supports that. It's not anything insane. And I think if people were only playing it in decks where you get a huge advantage out of the fixing aspect of the card, it would probably have an even higher win rate. But the point is, this card is pretty crucial in like competitive green decks in this format that can stand up to the aggro decks in red that we were talking about earlier. Speaking of red, there is one rare I want to talk about in this video. Mostly, this video is entirely commons and uncommons apart from this card. Obviously, those are the cards that are the most important. But there is one rare that stood out to me that I was sort of dumbfounded by how late it's being taken, especially when you compare it to its win rate. And that's Goblin Bombardment, which is at 62.8%, one of the highest win rates in the whole set. But it's not picked until pick 4.5, which is... way earlier than everything else on this list, but that is way too late for Goblin Bombardment. First of all, it's insane in red, white, and black, red, which have all these expendable bodies. It's also a free sack outlet that will make your Twisted Fealties and Ariet's Tempting Apples better. I said earlier, we don't really have any of those in this set. Well, you have this one that's on the bonus sheet, right? And, even if this format didn't have these two threaten effects, Bombardment would be great, but lots of red decks have one or both of those cards in it, and it's completely insane when you could steal your opponent's thing, hit them with it, sack it to ping something. Like, that is just completely bonkers when you can pull it off. But even absent of all of that, if your deck has like enough creatures in it, even if you're not going that wide, Goblin Bombardment is a card that is very much worth it. It makes combat into a nightmare for your opponent. It makes their removal significantly worse. It gives you the ability to do a bunch of damage out of nowhere. And, the only time it isn't good is if you have like no board state at all, but that just doesn't happen that often, especially if you're in red in this format. Most of the time you're going to play this and suddenly your board can do like 6 damage for no mana to your opponent or ping things. And you don't usually want to play it and do that right away unless you're going to kill your opponent. But you have it on the board. You can block things and sack them to ping things. It gets crazier if you have something like Totentons in play, who makes a 1/1 rat every time you have a creature, non-token creature die. Like, there's a bunch of little combos in this set that make Bombardment even better. But even in the absence of those, it's a card you want in basically every red deck. You're not going to have a red deck without enough creatures for Goblin Bombardment. And it turns out it's just a bomb. In the set review, I gave it a build-around grade that was really high. But, there always turns out to be cards I give a build-around grade to in a set that just always are that great, and that's basically where Goblin Bombardment ends up. It is just always good. You don't really have to build around it. Sure, it's like a maybe a B+ or an A- in your typical red deck. That's like the floor. But it's like an A+ if you end up in red, white, or black, red, and you can go really wide, and you have some of these combos I'm talking about. So should be taken a lot higher than pick 4.5 is my point here. It is very, very powerful. Let's look now at another blue card, Johans Stop Gap. This is another blue card that is, I think, fairly essential for blue to succeed. It has a 56% win rate, and it's picked around 8.7. So, this kind of effect where you return something to your opponent's hand and draw a card is always reasonable, in virtually any format. But the bargain upside here is nice, combines really well with Hatching Plans. It would be kind of interesting to know, what percentage of the time someone is sacking Hatching Plans for bargain on Stop Gap and how much of a role that's playing in this high win rate. But that is important to keep in mind. But, that's part of what makes Hatching Plans so good is you do have these common cards with bargain that are pretty nice already, and they get even better when you've got Hatching Plans around. But yeah, Stop Gap, bouncing things, drawing a card is extra good. Sometimes your opponent will suit up a token with, a young hero roll token, and it'll be all big and stuff, and bouncing one of those feels pretty good because it's just gone forever. But even just getting tempo and breaking even on cards with Stop Gap feels pretty good. You really need this to buy yourself the time to get to your Into the Fey Court, or your, maybe you already sacked Hatching Plans to this, but if you didn't find it already, to get that effectively game-winning card advantage, Johans Stop Gap can buy you more time to find it and dig you deeper in your deck. It's just a really good blue common. I mean, basically, the 3 blue commons that are in this video are blue's 3 best commons, and they all are fairly crucial for your blue decks to succeed. And that's part of the problem for blue, is there are a bunch of common duds that really weigh it down. But if you can get your hands on multiple Stop Gaps and spell stutters and at least one Into the Fey Court, your deck has a much better chance of succeeding. Hatching Plans, generally also a card that you need. I've talked about that card a lot, but it doesn't really fall into this category of needing to be picked higher. It's being picked really high. People have figured that out. It's being picked about where it should be, but it is another card that's really important for blue decks. Let's look now at Archons Glory. So this is a combat trick, and it turns out it's a pretty nice one with a 56.2% win rate, and it's picked around 9.6. I don't think this is being taken insanely late, but combat tricks in this format, especially the 1-mana ones, like the Monstrous Rage one, the 1 red mana, +3/+1 trample, you get a roll token one. That card is being taken really highly. And it should be. It's a great card and in this aggressive format. But I think Archons Glory should be getting taken around the same time. I don't think it's quite as good. Trample gives you this, big damage out of nowhere effect. Whereas with Archons Glory, you can kind of do that, but you'd have to cast it before blockers to give your creature flying, bargain and all of that at the same time. And that's not quite as good as just being able to do it all at instant speed, get this evasiveness at instant speed. But 1 mana for +2/+2 wins tons of combats in this format. And then you have this life link plus flying upside, which, again, like I just said, if your opponent's tapped out and you can just swing for lethal in the air, you'll do that by casting Archons Glory in your main phase. But even when you can't do that, bargaining and gaining a bunch of life is really good against the aggro decks in this format. Sometimes it just completely breaks the race and the math that they had in mind for finishing you off. In addition to usually killing something of theirs. So, life gain ends up performing quite well in this format where red decks are so good, because that's like red's ultimate weakness always, is running out of gas before they can kill the opponent. Archons Glory can help you do that. And it's also just good in the aggro decks too. If you're playing a red-white aggro deck yourself, this is just a great trick to have around. You'd probably rather have +3/+1 and trample than this, but it's not like Archons Glory is a slouch. In most of the really aggressive decks I play, I really like to have tricks, and there are some connected to creatures, like the Daredevil or whatever it's called. I'll have it on the screen, but the +2/+1 trick on one side, it's a 3 mana 4/2 on the other side. Those are really nice because you can get 2-for-1s out of them, but the efficiency of Archons Glory and Monstrous Rage, neither of those can really be beat by those types of cards. And, you know, you do want them and you do pick them, you know, not insanely high. Like you shouldn't be first picking combat tricks or anything like that, but they're pretty important for you to push through the last few damage, for you to keep your creatures, your smaller creatures competitive when your opponent's playing out their Hamlet gluttons and crap like that. Like you can really just keep the pressure on them, even when they're doing that, if you have good tricks around. And then the last card I want to talk about is Sweet Tooth Witch. It has a win rate of 57.5%. So of all the commons and uncommons we've looked at in this video, that's the highest win rate. And it's being taken around a 7th pick. This one's not like being taken insanely late, but it should probably be getting taken earlier. Again, you know, this whole video and these cards that have higher win rates than you might think, a lot of it revolves around, hey, aggro decks are really good. This is another one of those. I mentioned earlier, like black-green is the best deck at combating the red-white and black-red aggro decks in the format. And part of the reason for that is you have a bunch of good commons that just make food, and food is really good against those decks. Sweet Tooth Witch is one of those. You know, 3 mana, 3/2, make a food, and, you know, it's even a food payoff that can just in the game. Like if you get this late and you have a bunch of food in play, your opponent kind of has to kill it or lose, and that's something we're saying about a common. And then if you play it early, you have a card that's pretty good on curve, that gives you food, which you have other cards that care about. If you happen to have some cards with celebration in your deck, Sweet Tooth Witch can trigger that. It sets up bargain really well too. You know, getting an early food token is a great way to set up your Hamlet Glutton on turn 5. Like, there's a lot going on here to like about Sweet Tooth Witch, and it's performing like a really high level B- style common in this format. And I think that's because it's particularly well positioned between the bargain synergy and just being really good against all the aggro decks. Oh, there actually is one more card that I missed. I'm glad I looked back at my list. And that is Witch's Mark, which has a 57.1% win rate, and it's picked around a 9th pick. So, you know, the last couple sets have had really good Tormenting Voices. In the Lord of the Rings set, we had 3 mana, just, you know, a Tormenting Voice effect is one where you discard a card and draw 2. In the Lord of the Rings set, we had 3 mana, a 3 mana one, but it gave you a 1/1 in play. And that turned out to be like way better than anyone expected in that set because it adds to the board. Like, and that ends up really mattering on this kind of card. And similarly, this does too. Sure, it's a Wicked Roll token. You're not always going to have a target for it, especially if you need to cast this on like turn 2 so that you can find a land drop or something like that. And sometimes you just have to do that. But that's kind of the floor of the card. Most of the time, you get to put the roll token on something, and suddenly you have a much better board state in addition to digging deeper in your deck. It's nice in the blue-red deck because it's a spell that digs you deeper in your deck. It's nice if you're trying to set up bargain because it gives you a roll token. And it's nice in just all the red decks just because it helps you find more gas if you're one of these red aggro decks, while also sort of adding an inevitable 1 damage to the board in the form of the Wicked Roll token, in addition to just letting you do more damage because your creature can attack more effectively. So, yeah. So those are my picks for 10 cards that you should be playing more and taking higher in this draft format. They've all been really good, better than you'd think based on when people are taking them. So that does it for this video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to catch up on other videos, including more about this limited format, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.